Guru Radhe Radhe Guru Guru Radhe Guru.
Hello and welcome. In this episode of My Time with Radha, Swami Samayananda describes her first encounters with Swami Radha and shares her thoughts on what wisdom is. We discuss the difference between knowledge and wisdom as Swami Samayananda emphasizes the importance of acceptance, the power of choice, and the wisdom of limitation. Hi, Swami Samayananda.
Good morning, Katie, from the ashram.
Yeah, good morning from Montreal for me. I wondered if there was a prayer that you wanted to begin with.
I think I'd like to start with the Divine Light mantra. I am created by Divine Light. I am sustained by Divine Light. I am protected by Divine Light. I am surrounded by Divine Light. I am ever growing into Divine Light.
Thank you for that. That's a mantra that I work closely with in my day-to-day life when I'm walking or doing chores, but it's a completely different experience saying it now with you. So thank you for leading that. That was beautiful. I wanted to just start, as I do mostly with these, is from the beginning and how you started your connection with the ashram and with Swami Radha. So when did you first meet Swami Radha? And what was that like?
I first met her in 1978. I was in a PhD program in California in transpersonal psychology in Menlo Park. And the school was new. It had only been in existence for 3 years. And Swami Radha knew they were men at the time, but she knew the men who were starting the school. And their intention was to lift psychology into more the spiritual and also have a place more for women. And I went to California. I'd heard about the school. I'd been involved in transpersonal psychology and psychosynthesis. And I needed a change and thought that this might present a change in some way. Well, it did, but not quite in the way I had thoughts. So we were 22 in our group, and she taught the life seal. And I had been teaching at that point for a number of years in English as a second language and cross-cultural communication. So as a teacher, I knew somewhat what it meant to teach and learn in that environment. But I watched her in just absolute fascination, because with each person that came up to talk with her about their life seal, she approached it very uniquely. So there was no kind of set response to everything, but in some cases she would be very pointed. In others, she would laugh or just allow some very open-ended questions. She just listened to each person with kind of an open-hearted listening and being open-hearted to each person. And I was so struck by that. The other thing that happened for me was, as I sat and I listened to her be with these, the other people in our group, I remember writing in my journal, I feel like I'm listening to her through my skin. And I was kind of shocked by that. I had no idea. It was not at all an intellectual thing, but I couldn't understand it. But it was as if her words were going right into me. And years later, I made the connection with her very intense 5-hour-a-day mantra practice and then 2-hour-a-day mantra practice, and just all of the work that she had done herself, the spiritual work she had done herself. So that has stayed with me as one of those experiences that kind of stand out in a lifetime. That, again, I didn't understand then, but then later. And then at one point, she and I crossed in a hallway at the school. And I stopped her and I said, the only other person I've ever met like you is Roberto Assagioli. And he was the founder of psychosynthesis. And we had gone to study with him in Italy. And I had no idea where that came from. And she didn't say anything in response. But again, it was something that just came out of me. And then we both moved on with where we were going. So what was happening at that time, she spent quite a bit of time in the San Francisco area because that's where a lot of people were doing work in consciousness and defining it and what did it mean and experimenting with it. And of course, consciousness is at the center of her teachings. So she was very stimulated by being there and being with people. So all of the latest people who were doing that kind of work were teachers in our school. But that wasn't it for me. And it made me realize I was not interested in a PhD in psychology. And I couldn't have said at that time, oh my gosh, I'm going to drop my life and go be with Swami Radha. That wasn't it either, except something had been planted. So it took me a few more years and a travel across the US and then back to California again and settling in Redwood City, which is where my brothers were at the time. And she opened one of her teaching centers 20 minutes from where I was living. So I started going to weekly classes, and then she started coming quite often, actually, and giving workshops. So I had a fair number of workshops from her directly. And then I would see her sometimes when she came, and kind of one-on-one. And at one point she said, go to the ashram and do the 3-month course. And I said, okay. And I didn't have the money. And I was about ready to go to the bank to borrow the money to do it. And $5,000 landed in my lap in a real surprise. And so I ended up in 87 coming here and doing the course, and then went back to California again. And then in 1990, I immigrated to Canada and I lived in Vancouver. I had a job outside of Vancouver, and every vacation I would go to the ashram. And then if she was here, I would see her, at the ashram. And then at a certain point, I just decided I wanted to live here. And so there's more to the story and more detail to it. But I was here for a while, and then I went and I lived at a couple of our centers outside of here. And then in 2008, I came back. And in that time, I had done the teacher certifications, and I was teaching in the places where I lived. Quite a lot of teaching, actually. And then in 92, I was married at the time, and we moved in to Swami Radha had bought a center in Burnaby, right outside of Vancouver, and we moved in with her. So I only had about 6 months of that experience of day-to-day living with her, but it was such a learning, intense, beautiful, and again, just lots more seeds planted for me.
Wow. And so from initially meeting her, did you say 1977?
78.
1978 to then doing the YTC or YDC at the time, 10 years in between of you meeting the teachings and then taking your time to go back to the ashram. And now when you went to the ashram for the YTC or YDC, was that the first time you were there? You entered into the space?
Yes. And I up until that point, I didn't have any interest, really. The ashram was kind of this distant place where people lived and things happened. But because she spent so much time in California, I wanted to be with her. And I didn't even know really what the ashram was or what it looked like or anything. But then when she said, go do the 3-month course, I okay.
And what do you remember your first impressions when you entered into the space of the ashram, the land, the temple?
Well, there was no temple because it was 1987. So our temple was the beach prayer room for those people that know that space. It's a beautiful space, and it had been a temple-like space for ashram residents for lots of years. So the temple, the first temple actually wasn't built or wasn't ready for use until 92. But coming onto the land was, I was coming from the city and right downtown Vancouver. So coming onto the land it's just magical, with the lake and the mountains and the mosses and the birds and the care that's here, the care that's taken with everything.
Wow. Yes, I mean, I definitely can relate to that too, entering into the space of the ashram from Vancouver also for the first time, and that magical space and the quietness that exists. So now you've done the YDC and you go and you're still in California doing different classes with her. What was your impression of the teachings? What were the things that stuck with you at that time that you found helpful? I mean, clearly from the Life Seals workshop, you were already drawn in. How did that unfold?
Well, I had a friend who had been to the ashram, and he really helped me learn the dream method. So I was working with my dreams and the Kundalini book. I was going through the Kundalini book, doing reflections from it, because it's just full of questions. And I think probably more than anything was the fact that I had found teachings, or they had found me, that were so wide open to my exploration, to my understanding, taking me deeper and deeper into myself. And that was all the training as teachers that we received, was basically learning how to ask the questions. That on one hand, but then on the other hand, it also was continuing to do our own deep inner work so that we actually had something to offer. So it wasn't coming from my head or from even quoting Swami Radha, but coming from a very lived kind of teaching. And of course, then I would go back. I mean, a lot of my own study was, of course, going back to her books and her recordings.
Yeah, that quality of the lived really stands out here. And how did your relationship with her develop? Like, especially when you started living near her or in the same space with her. Is there a memorable moment you have of those times? Or a moment where she kind of shook up something for you or showed you something?
She was very good at doing that. Being with her in many ways was very unpredictable, because she was a wonderful observer and she listened. She's the best listener I've ever met. She could hear things and see things. She said one time, she said, people think I'm psychic, but she said, I'm not, I just observe. And so at times when I really needed some kind of encouragement, that would come. At times when I really needed to be challenged, that would come. So I would say, especially in those 6 months in living with her, I never knew. I lived downstairs, she lived upstairs, and I used to say, I never knew when I came up those stairs what there was going to be for me. There was always something for me. And sometimes it felt just warm and embracing. And sometimes it was a real challenge. And I had an implicit trust in her. Even if I didn't understand why she was asking me something, or why she was challenging me, or sometimes even the support at that moment. Like, what was she seeing? But it was an implicit trust. And that's different than blind trust for me. A blind trust is kind of being carried along without thinking and reflecting. But she would come forward with something, and that was my work then to go and reflect, do practice. Why is this coming? What is she seeing? What is she trying to say? What is she trying to show me?
Mm-hmm. So more than just receiving certain knowledge, but then actually reflecting on the knowledge and then experiencing it.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Well, I have so many more questions that will come as we continue. Before we continue, one thing that I'm curious about is upon first meeting her at that workshop, the Life Seals, I wonder if she was wearing her robe or not in that kind of setting of
No.
the academic setting. No, at that point she was not doing that. Yeah.
No, at that point, no. She had taken off the robe a number of years earlier. And so in many ways, she would appear like a little old lady or somebody's grandmother, or, she was not. But it was deceptive, if that's what you were thinking, by just looking at her. But if you had any kind of openness at all, mind, heart, skin, whatever, you knew pretty soon you were in the presence of somebody who was different. And we watched this, over and over again when she would be with a hairdresser. And suddenly they were having this profound conversations. Or I remember once being with her, with a lawyer, and, it had to do with one of her centers. And I just watched in amazement what happened in the next little while between the two of them. They were sharing memories, books. Swami Radha was offering things. Swami Radha gave her books, some of her books, actually. So it was, she waited. She waited to see. And if there was an opening, no matter where, she would enter into that opening and give.
And enter into the skin. Well, and that's really awesome. We already spoke, and you already kind of brought that in with talking about your process of reflecting and how your relationship with her wasn't just her telling you what to do, but you actually having to question it further for yourself, which I think leads us nicely to our theme for the day, which is wisdom. And I want to say a little bit before I read the quote that I chose from Swami Radha on why I chose on this theme, kind of in my discussion with you, based on largely a workshop that I had done with you a couple of years ago, on the wisdom of limitation. And that's always stuck a lot with me. And so I wanted to bring that forward in our conversation, but then also seeing you as one of my own main teachers. You were one of the co-teachers of the YDC when I did the YDC in 2022. And so seeing that wisdom kind of carried through you in your role as a teacher towards me, and then kind of becoming curious of how that theme and that idea existed in your relationship with Swami Radha and how you understand wisdom. So really, it's that point of curiosity within myself that's bringing this theme forward for us. And the quote that I discovered from Swami Radha is actually from Time to Be Holy, where she's sort of talking about a bunch of things, really, but in this quote, highlighting the importance of accepting challenges and facing things with discipline in order to be able to experience certain aspects of life, and then therefore developing the wisdom. She writes, "At some time, you will have to accept the challenge to walk through life in darkness, not knowing really where you are going, hoping it is the right direction toward the divine. Increase self-mastery, increase self-control, increase your faith, increase your desire to gain in wisdom, because that makes for liberation and sets you free. And always remember that the divine spark, the essence, is imperishable."
Oh dear, what can I say now?
My skin. I really like that image of the skin. It's going to stick with me for a while. Yeah, so what is wisdom?
I had a bit of time to think about this because, of course, I knew this was our focus. And last night, what came to me was the phrase that we use every night in satsang. When we light a candle, and it's to invite the light into the presence of our time together, our devotional time together, and to invite the light into ourselves. What we say, the phrase is, "May all of our selfish desires be burned in the fire of wisdom. So I was thinking about that. I mean, I've heard it for years, but it was actually lovely to have more time to really think about that. What does that mean? So I started with selfish desires, thinking about how those can really be anything where I have my focus in a very limited way on me, on mine, on whether it's something emotional, you did this to me, or a mental limitation, something that I'm holding that won't let something else in, physical, some kind of physical way that I'm really holding in myself. And so it's not like what I've had to learn is to set aside the critic, to set aside the judge. Oh, selfish, that's not right. It's not good. It's whatever. The fact is we're human and we have to have something to grow through. And a lot of what has been my experience that I've grown through and continue to grow through are those things that cling to me as mine. And so the wisdom for me in that comes from what we were talking about earlier. Something happens. I don't feel very good about it. I take some time to step aside, to reflect. Why don't I feel good about this interaction? Something I just said, or an interaction with another person. And why not? Not in a judgmental way, but what can I learn from this? And that at a certain point, I have to lift it from the imagination or the emotional part to my heart. And I have to say, well, what's my desire, my real, true, deep desire in this situation? Let's say if it's with another person. Is it to hold on to my point of view or to my emotional reaction? Or is it somehow to soften and open so that I can open to this person, which doesn't necessarily mean I have to accept everything that person has said or done, but it's the opening. And then in that opening and experimenting with it and trying it out, I learn. And then when something comes up the next time that is similar, I can rely on that learning. And I may not get it right away, but then I go, oh yeah, this is very similar to that other situation. So what did I do? So I'm quicker. And to a point where eventually I'm right in the moment in a situation and I can respond in that open-hearted kind of way based on my learning and my past experience. So to me, that whole process is really a key to wisdom. And then that becomes what I can also offer as not as this great wise person, but, from my learning. This is what I've learned. This is how it's worked for me. So I think there's something too about intentionally in that process, a bridge is built to the intuition, or that's what I'll call it anyway, that my ideal is to want to be wise in a situation, not to be reactive. It's listening. And this is a lot of what we do in teaching is that we listen. What are people saying? So I listen. I'm in the situation. I can stay there in the moment. What do I hear from myself? What do I hear from the other person? But it's a subtler listening. It's a subtler kind of listening. And that takes practice. It takes time. And it takes it being a priority. So how am I being guided in this moment? What am I hearing in this moment that's based on my past, my learning, and what I want in my heart?
Mm-hmm. So it's more than receiving information and then taking it kind of as it is, but rather really looking to see how it relates to the past, the present, and how one wants to kind of be in the world, which I think is a really interesting distinction. You really emphasize that quality of experience as being really important here in regards to wisdom. And it's something that I've had to face in my studies, in my academic studies of Hinduism and yogic traditions, and how different it is to read a text kind of at surface value, taking it as such, gaining the knowledge from the text, but then how is that kind of transformed into wisdom? What is that difference and what is that process? So what do you think is kind of the bridge? You mentioned the bridge. What is the bridge between knowledge and wisdom?
Well, for me, it's just going back to the reflection, the learning, the applying. And the intuitive part, the word that came to me is surrender. It's like in that moment, I don't want to react. I don't want to just say the first thing that comes into my mind. So I need to surrender in order to listen and to really sense, again, what is it that I really want in this situation? What is the outcome I would really like? It may not happen, but what can I do to foster that?
And how did wisdom exist in your relationship with Swami Radha? How did the idea of wisdom play a role?
Well, I think one thing I would say is that there was no difference between who she was and how she lived. And I think that was a large part of what I didn't know how to say that. But I think looking back, that's a large part of what I felt in that very first meeting, is that she wasn't talking about, she was being. And so to me, it's because she knew, she had lived what she was talking about. And I could feel it, and other people could feel it. Not everybody was open to that. But if there was an opening, you knew. And then over the years, it's been studying some of the more ancient texts myself and seeing, wow, I mean, here are the teachings in these texts. And she did exactly what her teacher asked her to do. And that was to translate them so that here in the West, we could understand, and not just understand, but learn, practice, transform our lives. So just entering into her books in a way of really wanting to study personally, and I don't mean it in an intellectual sense, but using our intelligence and really taking it in very personally. It's all right there. And I, sometimes I think, yeah, it sounds like a little bit like, somebody who's totally bowled over by their teacher. And it's true. I am. I see her genius. And I know it's not everybody's way in for sure, but it certainly was mine. So it was kind of, being around her, she had a way of seeing things from many angles. She had a way of expansive thinking, brainstorming. Well, we could do this, we could do that, we could do this, we could do that. And at first it was like, oh my gosh, please, no, it was too many. But that was her way. And then she would wait and see, well, what came forward? Who came forward? And, somebody else over here had a dream. Well, tell me about your dream. And there may be a connection there. And then she would have a bit of a plan, and then she would let go of it. And I watched her do this. And in two cases where she had a plan and she let go of it and waited. And it was that surrender. It was that listening that I was talking about just a minute ago. And then something would come and she would either say, well, okay, that wasn't the plan. Or she would say, yep, okay, let's take the next step. So she was always asking questions and she was always giving space. She was giving space for the person to explore, to think. And I have a kind of a funny I don't know if it's a story, but I would go see her in Spokane. I was living in Vancouver, and then at the ashram, she was in Spokane. So I would go to Spokane to see her. And she would say, well, I'd like you to write me a paper on why you got married. And I'd think, wow, like she just asked me to do this 3 months ago. And I wrote a paper and I gave it to her. Why is she asking me again? That was exactly the same question. Or she would ask me, what is the purpose of your life? Same thing. I'd think, well, I wrote that and I sent it to her 3 months ago. And now she's asking me again. And she kept asking.
On
and
the
I'm
same
not
topic?
alone. I was not the only person. It was her way of encouraging us to not stay at a particular level or think we had the answer or think we knew it all, but to, okay, what if you go a step deeper? What if you look a little further? Like, is there something more for you to see? She wasn't seeing something and trying to get us to see the same thing she was seeing. She wanted it for us and to really understand our choices and the steps we were taking and why we were taking them.
What I'm reminded of as I hear you tell the story of, that kind of repetitive writing and reflecting of certain questions is the line, it's a quote from her in her final message, I believe, and it's on some of the small cards around the ashram with the temple on it. And I'm probably not saying it quite accurately with all the words, but it's your life, it's your evolution of consciousness. Nothing else matters.
That's it. And she said that over and over and over, whether it was that quote directly or whether it was her questioning or whether it was her encouraging. That's it. I mean, in the end, that's what we have is ourselves. Like that, we can't take anything else with us. And so she was encouraging us to really know that consciousness. What is it? And how does it influence your life? And how do you connect with it? What do you learn from it? And the encouragement always was in opening yourself in that way. It's like everything just becomes bigger and more spacious. It's not that everything becomes beautiful and shiny and I get everything I want. It's not that at all. It's a whole other level of living and listening and learning and giving.
You put that very beautifully. Thank you for that. And I already mentioned kind of this buzzword in my head of wisdom of limitation. And I wondered if you could speak more about that. What is the wisdom in limitation or of limitation?
Well, I think the first thing is needing to recognize that limitation is. Like whether we are physically limited, whether we're mentally limited, whether we're emotionally limited, it simply is. So, as we age, we can't do as many things as we used to do. As we study, there may be certain things we get and other things we don't get. So we can't have it all. And why would we want to have it all on that kind of human level anyway? Like there's more. And so part of it for me is accepting. Yeah, there are limitations. And there's a reason for it. Can I understand what the reason is? So I'll give a personal example. In October, I went to California to visit my family. And I had 4 COVID vaccinations before I went. The area I was going to in California was high in COVID infections. But I thought, well, okay, I'm very cautious. I wear a mask whenever I go outside. And I've had all these vaccinations. I was planning on being fine. 3 days in, I got COVID. So here I am on family vacation, connecting with my family, haven't seen them in 3 years, and I'm isolated. And so the majority of my time there was in isolation with myself. And, I didn't particularly like it. And I didn't like having spent the money and not being able to be with my family. And it was what it was. I mean, I know enough by now not to fight it. I mean, how can you fight COVID? You get it and you have to live through it and be with it. And then So eventually I had to extend my ticket and I got on a plane, came back to the ashram. And it's like I got it again once I was back here, but worse. And I was flat out in my bed. I couldn't go for meals. I couldn't get out of bed. I had no appetite. I coughed like just crazy coughing. And there was not a thing I could do, especially the fact we don't have doctors here. So, to even have a phone appointment with a doctor across the lake takes a couple of days. And all I could do was, after a little bit of real deep annoyance, was to surrender. And I surrendered in order to heal. And that's continued. I still have some effects from having been sick then. And I have to constantly surrender because I'm very much a doing kind of person. I like being active. I like being involved. And the limitations that I have a few of them are still there for me. So that's an example, person example. And I know that the healing won't happen. It won't totally happen unless I stop pushing and just accept. It's a process, and I have to go through that process. So even with our recording today, right before the recording, I start coughing and I can't stop coughing and I can't stop coughing. And I'm really disappointed. This hasn't happened for 2 weeks. Why this morning did it happen? And then I just said, well, okay, if we can't do the recording today, we'll set up another time to do it. So it's, that's my personal example of it. But it all begins with, I think, that question. Well, first of all, with acceptance and also what's happening and how am I going to embrace? And that's not easy. It's not easy to, for me anyway, to not push and fight and be disappointed, but to really open and accept. And Radhananda talks about in her introduction in the Yoga of Healing book, she talks about that embracing what has come. And boy, that's, sometimes it's easier than others. But I think that's the real key. So the limitation is there. What am I experiencing emotionally, physically, in my imagination? Is this going to last forever? Will this ever end? And then being able to say, you know what? This is what is. In this moment, this is what is. What's my choice? What am I going to do? So I would say too, at the ashram, we face limitations a lot. Like we don't have enough money to do every kind of maintenance thing, or we have enough money to do maybe 2 this year. Meanwhile, we need new sewers and we need all kinds of things to maintain 25 buildings and 115 acres. And we can't. We have to make a choice. Okay, what's the most pressing? What's the priority? Or sometimes it's, gosh, we don't have quite enough people to do the work we had set out for ourselves. So how do we change? And I think that's a lot of it too, is looking at what the limitation is that's presenting itself, and then how do I become flexible in that? How do I see what are some options? How can I explore those options and not stay stuck on my original idea, or what I want? So living in community like this is an excellent way to learn about limitation and what the wisdom is in it, and then how the wisdom can help open up ways to work through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the key words really of flexibility and choice, the power of choice to live in the limitation and see what needs to be done rather than being kind of attached to the ideas of what should be or what you want them to be.
Yeah.
And hearing your story of being sick reminded me of my story of visiting the ashram this Christmas. And on the second day, just being hit by the flu and being in quarantine for the rest of the time. And I'm kind of similar to you in that way of really liking to do and be in action, especially when I'm coming back to a community I love after being gone, but then having to accept that and just be in that space of rest and relaxation, or at least try to get to that relaxation, acceptance, surrender, and choice.
And I will say we missed you. We knew you were here.
So close, but so far. Yeah. Wow. And I wonder too if there's kind of a memory that's fresh in your mind of your time with Swami Radha that either captured this kind of wisdom or not, if it's about something else that you would like to share, that's fresh for us to hear.
Yes. She was interested in starting a center in the Vancouver area. She asked a couple of us to go and look, if we had the time, could we go and look at some real estate? So we found a place. There weren't really many places that we saw that would be suitable for a center for teaching. But we found a house that was really questionable. So we sent her these 3 options that we had looked at. And she came to Vancouver and we went with her to look at these places. And one of them, actually, she had looked at it a little bit previously, and she had asked a friend who was an architect to come and take a look at the house. And so anyway, this day we were gathered at this place. And I was still surprised because the house was little and it just didn't seem very suitable for a center. And then we found out that she had actually already put a down payment on it. And I was so surprised. I said to Swami Lalitananda, she was Julie at the time, I said, "Did you know that?" And she said, "No." And so we went inside and sat around a table that was inside. And she said, "You're probably wondering why I bought this house." And we're all going, "Yes," because we really didn't know. And she said, "Well, there were some people who were very connected to the work, who are currently in Toronto, but who were in a situation where she didn't know if it was going to be sustainable for that person. And so this could be a place where that person could come and live and teach." And so she was looking ahead at, again, some of the people who were really close to her and what needs might be. But there was something else that she spoke about. The house was full of Kuan Yins, statues, pictures. It had been owned by a Vietnamese family who were devoted to Kuan Yin. And above the fireplace, they had this very large picture of their guru. And so that said something to Swami Radha about what was in that house, how the house had been honored and used. And it might be the kind of place that could serve to support some of the people, again, who were really close to her and who had devoted their lives to her, who might shortly need to move or have another place to be. So that was a number of years ago, for sure. But it always struck me that she listened on that level as well. Like, what was the environment saying to her? It wasn't just a matter of, yes, and actually what she did was she made an offer on the house and they said no. And so she said, "Oh, okay, we'll keep looking." And then they came back about a month later and accepted her offer. So a similar thing happened with the other house that she bought that actually ended up being the teaching center, where she walked in and it was more suitable as a teaching center. And there were chariots on the walls. And of course, her love of Krishna and the Gita and the chariot and her own dreams. Again, it wasn't that she just said, oh, this is it because of that. She had the house checked. Again, she made an offer, and the offer was denied. And then a little while later, they contacted her and they accepted the offer. So anyway, those are a couple stories that are related, but ones that have always stayed with me about her ability to plan and think and do all the work that needed to be done on this kind of physical human level. And then she would hand it over to the light and she would wait.
Thank you for sharing that. Those are beautiful stories, especially the symbolism of Kuan Yin and the chariot, of course, with her love of Krishna. And I'm curious as to how you connect with Swami Radha today. How does she show up in your day-to-day? And how is your relationship with her?
Well, this year, the ashram is celebrating its 60th anniversary. So we've been in this place for 60 years. And of course, it was her following through with what Shivananda had asked her to do, which was to establish an ashram. And recently, I've gone back to read a collection of the very first newsletters that the ashram sent out to people. And they're just full of wonderful anecdotes about what it was like to be here when it was so rustic. And the buildings, many of the buildings weren't here. And they didn't have much food and had to live with bears and cougars and whatever. It was just a very different life. Certainly for her, it was a very different life. And there's something about having read those newsletters and those words that has taken me very deeply back into the past. I was not here, but trying to imagine what it must have been like for her to be here as a 45-year-old woman or older at that point with, a bunch of 18-year-old young men who had their own ideas about things and didn't, in a lot of ways, didn't really understand her vision and Shivananda's request to her. So it's given me a lot of very deep appreciation, which I've always had, but even more so of what she did with her life. Because it wasn't just the establishing of the ashram, it was going out and spreading the teachings, offering the teachings, which again, Shivananda had asked her to do, and being gone for months and months at a time and coming back and having to put things back in order because the young man had changed things around. So again, I think the 60th has really taken me back in deepening my own sense of gratitude to her. And every time I teach, it's the same thing because I'm going back to her words. I'm going back to her experience. And I had mentioned this earlier, but reading some of the sacred texts and then seeing, wow, here are the teachings and here are her words. Here's how she translated it so that I could understand, because I don't think as a Westerner, I would have developed kind of the spiritual life I have with those old texts, because they were full of Sanskrit and full of imagery and full of things that I couldn't really understand. But having her teachings, I could see, oh, okay, here's the thread all the way from those thousands of years ago to today. So it's certainly through her writing. It's certainly through exploring, again, entering back into that 60 years of history. And every night, she's there. She's in the temple. And that's what she said, that she would live in the temple. And so I often feel her presence there. And she's certainly part of my practice, my daily practice and that connection. So it's a growing and deepening understanding of what she gave me and a real heart-opening gratitude that I could never pay her back, really, except through my daily actions and trying to do my best and be the best person I can be and live these teachings in my daily life.
And I think another component of that too is the incredible wisdom that you carry forward for young people like me to gain these teachings. And in some ways, I would consider that as kind of paying that back towards her of what she carried for you and how you're carrying that forward. And for that, I am incredibly grateful. So thank you, Swami Samayananda. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me and for giving me these glimpses of Swami Radha and your relationship with her, and also kind of opening that door of this idea of wisdom and how it can be developed and experienced through deep reflection and that quality of questioning and really looking into oneself to understand the wisdom in limitation and also developing wisdom within oneself.
Okay, Katie, thank you very much. This has been a real opportunity for me to go back to and reflect. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day. Namaste.
You too. Hari Om.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. Yasodhara Ashram is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Ktunaxa and Sinixt peoples. You can learn more about the ashram by visiting our website at yasodhara.org. You can also follow us on Instagram and YouTube. Until next time, I'm Katie Taher, and this is My Time with Radha.